Hello, everybody. Good morning. I'm a practicing therapist and I work with a lot of individuals with attachment wounds. I'm also a doctoral student of psychology. And today I wanted to go over a question that I had quite a bit. And I made a video on this, but I wanted to make an updated one. And it's the attachment style that I notice avoidants chase the most and pursue, actually. And when I mean avoidant, typically when I work with avoidant individuals, it's typically dismissive avoidance. I do work with some fearful avoidance, but they usually present more dismissive than they do anxious. So it's something to keep in mind. And actually, it is the answer is that it's another avoidant. So typically, if it's a dismissive avoidant, it's going to be a fearful avoidant. And then if it's a fearful avoidant, it's going to be a dismissive avoidant. And actually, this pair works a lot. From my perspective and what I notice, it's also the pair that I see is the most successful for an avoidant, which is another avoidant. And particularly if it's a dismissive avoidant, what ends up happening is they tend to pick, not all the time, but I see the fearful avoidant, they tend to, as the relationship progresses and the dynamic starts to match a little bit better, both of them start becoming a little bit more secure as well. Now, this could be more common with fearful avoidants that tend to be more dismissive leaning, but I think it depends. So why are avoidants, particularly dismissive avoidants, often attracted to fearful avoidants? Particularly the reason is because they actually possess both anxious and avoidant traits, so they exhibit both throughout the relationship, which actually creates a unique situation which allows the avoidant individual, dismissive avoidant, to feel the emotional availability and affection from their partner, but also have the built-in space due to the avoidant side. And for a fearful avoidant, why a dismissive avoidant tends to be quite attractive is because they are able to not feel judged for having their needs and their space, while still having, when they're anxious, they have the dismissive avoidance unwavering confidence that's able to reassure them and kind of put an end to some of their anxieties quite easily. And for a fearful avoidant, they communicate very similar. So if a dismissive avoidant is saying, well, you don't need to worry about that. Like, that's not something to worry about. An anxious person will take that as too blunt or too offensive or not being taken seriously. A fearful avoidant will take this as, oh, okay, that's all I needed to know. I was freaking out over this, but I feel much more reassured because you just cut it down like that. And so the way that a fearful avoidant and dismissive avoidant communicates, it fits a lot better. There's not a lot of need to necessarily change the way they communicate because it's very similar, right? And I think that's something to always remember. It's very important, okay? The next one is comparison to both partners. Well, no, sorry. Comparison to prior partners that both individuals have had. Both fearful avoidant and dismissive avoidance, when they're both leaning avoidant, typically, they have had a history of anxious partners. And that's not wrong or right. But as a lot of you guys know who are anxious or who are avoidant, anxious and avoidant is a very challenging blend because individuals who are either one of those two, their needs are almost the complete opposite. They're actually very different. And so unfortunately, it creates a very challenging circumstance to where both individuals have to change so much about who they are, it's almost impossible. And both individuals become very frustrated and upset with that dynamic. It can work, but it is much more challenging. So imagine if you're in that situation and then you go to a person who's a little bit more similar to you. It makes the relationship even more refreshing. And so that becomes a deep sense of attraction. Think about it like this. An anxious person, when they start dating a secure person, they feel so accepted and loved and like their needs matter. That's exactly how fearful and dismissive avoidant individuals feel when they meet each other, right? That they get their needs met. They feel a sense of attraction, connection that they were not able to necessarily get with their previous partner. And this is not all the time. I'm not saying that an anxious and avoidant couple cannot work. I'm just saying these are the reasons why avoidants tend to chase and be a little bit more emotionally available for another avoidant for these reasons, okay? It's not always, but it is common. The next one is the component of safety is very prominent, and affection becomes common as well. So I guess we'll say this as a safety. Fearful avoidants tend to be more affectionate than dismissive avoidants sometimes, right? When they're a little bit more on the anxious because fearful avoidance, they fluctuate through the relationship. So they may have moments where they're avoidant, and they may have moments where they're anxious, and they may have moments where they may be having traits of both, right? And so that creates a sense of safety at some point. The affection is much more common, where a fearful avoidant may show affection to their partner and be emotionally available. And that helps the dismissive avoidant to feel safe, which they perceive to be genuine typically, because they know, it sounds a little strange, but because the fearful avoidant has presenting characteristics of wanting space and not wanting to commit, they feel that the affection the fearful avoidant is giving is very genuine instead of suffocating. And because they feel like that, the dismissive avoidant individual becomes a little bit more emotionally available as well and more willing to be affectionate as well. So they both get affection and space at the same time. And so there's a lot of affection and safety. And so the fourth one is actually they both get space. And both attachment styles basically have an appreciation and understanding for how valuable space is to them. And it allows them to feel like they're not pressured for commitment. They're not pressured to hang out with one another often. And it facilitates this very calm sense of connection that is very low pressure and paced on their feelings instead of on external perspectives. So, for example, a lot of anxious individuals, which isn't a bad thing, by the way, because some secure individuals do this as well. They're very, how would I say this? Anxious individuals compare their relationship a lot to other relationships. So it might be their friends, it might be TV shows, whatever they're seeing, maybe articles, right? And so the anxious individual, their expectation for the relationship feels very pressured because they want to meet those specific demands that they have in their own mind. Fearful avoidance and dismissive avoidance do not do that. So the pacing feels more natural to them. They often feel like it's low pressure and they're able to commit on their own time. And that's a lot of times why these relationships, from what I see, tends to work a little bit more easier and more fluid, because they don't have that pressure. That space is built into their relationship. They don't mind if they don't see each other every day or even once a week. That doesn't really, sometimes that bothers them, but often once or twice a week, they're good like that for years. And then once they get more closer and then they move in together and they take a long time, but often it allows them both to feel safe. And so that built-in space is really important. The next one, this one's a little strange, and I'm going to try and explain it, but I see this very common, more common with dismissive avoidance to fearful avoidance. It's not too common with fearful avoidance, but I still see it. It's like they're drawn to the aspect of mystery or ambiguity of their partner. Dismissive avoidants tend to be drawn to the mystery, I guess, associated with the fearful avoidance. So fearful avoidance, they're guarded. They're very guarded, and they have a lot of insecurities that they just do not share with people typically. And their anxieties, they bottle it up. So they can, so often they're feeling extremely anxious, but on the outside it may come across a little bit more detached or very hot and cold. And that mysterious nature allows the avoidant individual to not feel like there's innate pressure, and it allows them to feel like they are not solely responsible for the change of the relationship, because the fearful avoidant, it's very clear, it sounds a little unfortunate, but it's very clear that they have their own wounds, and a lot of fearful avoidance, because this fearful avoidance, the main difference between a fearful avoidant and a dismissive avoidant is they both don't trust other people, but fearful avoidants also struggle with trusting themselves. Dismissive avoidants, they trust themselves a little too much, but they don't trust other people, right? And so a fearful avoidant, they're very mysterious and very withdrawn, but they also are a little bit more comfortable accepting criticism in comparison to a dismissive avoidant. And so it allows dismissive avoidants to feel like they're not always going to be wrong, right? So when a dismissive avoidant is with an anxious partners tend to, I'm just being honest, I'm not saying all anxious partners are like this, but they tend to like to point the finger at the dismissive avoidant. You're wrong. You need to fix this. This is not how it's supposed to go. Because in their mind, they're feeling abandoned continuously. And so they're trying to fix this abandonment they're feeling. So they're saying, you're the cause of the abandonment. It's not it's not their fault, it's a wound, but they're thinking of it in the actual survival way. You're the cause of my trigger, so you need to fix this. But the avoidant individual takes it as, okay, you're telling me that I'm wrong. Fearful avoidants don't feel that way. Fearful avoidants don't tend to do that. They tend to just feel very anxious about certain things, but they're never going to say, they might do it sometimes, but often they're not going to sit there and be like, okay, I'm feeling abandoned. The dismissive avoidant needs to change. Fearful avoidants don't tend to do that. Typically what they do, I'm feeling abandoned, let me pull away. And this makes the dismissive avoidant, that mysterious nature, come in. The dismissive avoidant tends to chase that a little bit more, okay? The next one is communication. Now, dismissive avoidance and fearful avoidance, they tend to communicate more similarly. Now, as I had mentioned before, a lot of anxious individuals, they resort to indirect communication. Let's say, for an example, this is something that took me a while to understand. Just in general, my nature, I do not lean anxious much at all. And so this was even hard for me as a therapist to understand. It took me a while and I'm still getting used to it. A lot of you guys who have been following me for a while, whenever I started this channel, you guys know that anxious individuals are still something I'm still learning. So anytime I make a mistake about it, just, help me out. But this is something that took me a really long time to understand. And one day, actually, a patient helped me to understand this. And what it basically is that anxious individuals, they communicate indirectly, which is not my style. And it's also not a lot of avoidance style. I think secure individuals also communicate a little indirectly, but let me explain. An anxious individual, if they say, you're so detached and so cold, what I learned as a therapist, and what I think a lot of avoidant individuals struggle with this one, they're not actually saying you're cold. They are, but that's not really what they're saying. What they're actually saying, it's going to sound really weird. I feel like I'm doing it's a lot for me. They're not actually saying you're cold and you're mean and you're heartless. They are, but what they're actually saying is you're not giving them something, which is really, really hard to pick up. It's really hard to pick up, but they're saying give me attention, or you made a mistake you didn't meet a need. That's what it is. When they're saying that, they're saying you didn't meet a need. And sometimes they're saying you didn't meet a need continuously, but they don't say that directly. They almost never do. And that is so different from somebody who is avoidant in any direction, but especially if you're dismissive avoidant, that is not how you operate at all. And so the communication between an anxious and avoidant is so difficult. Both people it is so hard, right? Both of their brains are exploding, right? The anxious individual is saying something, but they mean something else. And the avoidant individual is saying something and they mean that exactly, but the anxious person does not take it that way. So an avoidant individual, if they say, the reason why I don't want to commit is because we fight too much. That is literally what it is. But an anxious person will think, okay, it's something in between this. Maybe you're just saying that because you're an avoidant, which might be true, but it's also exactly what they're saying. An anxious person takes it indirectly. And so they don't stop the fighting. Whereas if it's very simple, if you stop fighting, the avoidant will commit. That's literally what they're saying. That's literally what it is. An anxious individual, for some reason, that just goes over their head. An anxious individual, they operate very opposite. Avoidant individuals don't do that. So fearful avoidant and dismissive avoidance, they communicate very, very directly, and it's very appealing for other individuals because it removes the uncertainty in discussions. Now, I am not picking on anxious individuals. Please do not think that way. I think anxious individuals are extremely endearing. I think it's so beautiful how anxious individuals can feel so powerful. If anybody is an avoidant or was an avoidant or works with avoidance, I think you'll realize that actually dismissive avoidance and fearful avoidance, but especially dismissive avoidance, sometimes wish that they could feel that way. So please, if you're an anxious individual, do not feel like that is a bad thing. It's like a superpower. You can feel so much. You're so complex. And it's amazing, right? It's like an emotional genius, how you can have so many emotions, layers. It's just too much. It's too much for a lot of individuals. You got to understand, and I tell patients this, and I'm bad at explaining this, but you guys are doing emotional calculus. We're still stuck at avoidance, and just people who are more that way are stuck at 2+2. Like, just slow down. And it's not your fault. It's a great trait. You guys are blessed that you can do that, but avoidant individuals cannot do that. So if you're an anxious person watching this, just remember, you got to slow it down, dumb it down emotionally for avoidant individuals. Just a little bit of a tangent. I'm sorry. Just, it was something I felt like was important. But avoidant individuals, they communicate very similarly. The next one is conflict. Now, this one is very interesting because this happens, it depends, and we'll talk about it. Okay, so fearful avoidant individuals, they can be direct in their communication. Sometimes this creates even more conflict, but often what happens, which I notice if I'm observing couples that are avoidant, they still talk like they're business partners. I don't know if that's healthy, but that's what it looks like, right? So a fearful avoidant might be like, you really hurt me when you rejected my advance in the bedroom. Or that would be probably more dismissive avoidant, but let's just, whatever. A fearful avoidant is saying that. Dismissive avoidant will say, well, I rejected your advance because you made me feel like you didn't want it. You made me feel like you were doing it just for me. So this is a typical dynamic, by the way, why avoidants pull away from intimacy. It's bedroom intimacy. It's because they feel like the other person doesn't want it. But anyways, so they are having this conversation, and it's like, it's very direct. It might even be pointing fingers, but it's pointing fingers in a way where it's not an emotional conversation. And so the other one digests it a lot easier. They might not even find a solution, but both of them at least feel a little bit resolved that they got it off their chest. And because sometimes there is volatility, and I'll talk about that in a bit. But if there's no volatility, typically what ends up happening is the individuals, whether or not they get a solution, they still feel connected because they got to share something without judgment. Now, fearful avoidance, sometimes they do have a lot of volatility, and that often does not work with dismissive avoidance. However, what I notice with fearful avoidance is even if they start volatile, they start more anxious, that tends to die down as they tend to connect and commit with their avoidant partner, dismissive avoidant. And the avoidant partner, because they're noticing the fearful avoidant is being less emotionally engaged, or emotionally provoked is a better word. Emotionally provoked. The dismissive avoidant tends to give more of their needs. They meet their partner's needs more often. And so what ends up happening is the fearful avoidant starts becoming more calmer. Dismissive avoidant starts becoming more loving. And their communication in handling conflict becomes more closer to resolution. So they are able to get a resolve. And it's a little bit businesslike, which looks a little odd if you're a secure or anxious person, but it works for them. And if it works, right? And I think that's very nice. The next one, and this one is not very healthy. I would say it's an unfortunate reason why they're drawn to one another, but it is what it is. I'm just making this video for information. Dismissive avoidance and fearful avoidance tend to shut down in conflict. I think a lot of you guys know that. And so what ends up happening is it allows the other person to avoid confrontation, because dismissive avoidant and fearful avoidant individuals, they like to resume life as if conflicts never happen, right? They just want to pretend it never happened. They like to, brush things under the rug. And unfortunately, that plays to the other avoidance deactivating strategy. And so it comforts them because they don't like arguing. And so what ends up happening is they tend to feel safer with one another because there's less arguments in the relationship. That's just something I notice. And like I said, it's not necessarily healthy because you do need to face some of your attachment fears, but this allows the relationship to last for a very long time. And when they start healing, they're able to face those fears a little bit better. So that's why that happens. The next one is lack of commitment. Honestly, that's the best way I would word it. Dismissive avoidance and fearful avoidance tend to acknowledge that they have commitment issues. They just typically know it. And what ends up happening is they understand their partners has a similar struggle. And so they're not pressured to commit. And so actually, strangely enough, that motivates them to put more effort in this relationship because they feel like, okay, this is finally a relationship that can meet my needs, that I'm not going to be pressured to commit. So I want to work hard to keep this going. And so they end up healing themselves, which I really like seeing. It's very common, actually. The next one is they have a sense of similarity. So A lot of fearful avoidant and dismissive avoidance, they're structured and rigid. Not all of them are. Unfortunately, another way of saying that is they're uncompromising. This part can be conflicting. They both are really stubborn. But ends up happening is they actually begin to respect one another. As I've mentioned multiple times on my channel, avoidance, respect is more important than love. In fact, that is how they fall in love, respect. And so they respect one another because they speak the same emotional language. They feel a sense of similarity. Their hobbies tend to be similar. A lot of avoidance, especially fearful avoidant, but dismissive avoidance as well, they're not the most social people. Not all the time, but it's pretty common, right? And so what ends up happening is they end up being pretty low-key. They don't need a lot of attention from other people. And so this creates a sense of similarity. Sometimes I can see it like almost like an us against the world type of couple, which might not always be healthy, but that's what tends to happen. They tend to get very close slowly, but then they start feeling like they have a unique and special relationship, and they fight for that relationship dearly because it's like, this is all they have. And it used to be for them, both of them, it's usually they used to be me, myself, and I, because they're avoidance, right? So they're all by themselves on this island. But you know what ended up happening? Another island started coming closer, and then they made a little bridge, right? And then slowly, maybe they, I don't know, build more land and whatever. They connect these islands much closer until it becomes one island. They may always have little spaces where they're not together. However, overall, they tend to combine this person in their inner life because of that sense of similarity. They tend to have similar interests. They tend to have more hobbies. Avoidants in general have more hobbies than anxious individuals typically. And so they're able to communicate on that sense. The sense of similarity in terms of seeing each other, frequency of seeing each other, commitment, timelines, needing to decompress. These are all very similar. Also, a lot of individuals, both avoidant styles, they tend to struggle with neglect in their life. Fearful avoidants, unfortunately, tend to have a history of abuse as well, but not all the time, but it is more common. Because of that, they also are not entirely so emotionally close to their families. I don't know if it's emotionally close. It might be physically. They're not as close. They tend to not have a entirely large family system. And so they tend to also have that similarity as well. They tend to have a similar childhood they can connect with. And the very last one is they challenge each other to heal. And so let's give an example of a dismissive avoidant and a fearful avoidant female. So let's say dismissive avoidant male. He's typically used to anxious individuals who they may threaten to leave, but they never do. Or when they leave, they want the partner back, or they're still very attached to their partner. And so the dismissive avoidant knows they can still be friends with this person and get some of those relationship benefits. You see that a lot with avoidance, right? They tend to be friends with their anxious ex or just an anxious person because they feel like the anxious individual. This may not always be true, but this happens a lot. And a lot of avoidant individuals in my practice, they literally say this verbatim and they feel guilty about it. But they say, basically, this partner does not challenge me. Like, I don't have to change. This is fine. They're going to accept it. And until I'm ready, this is usually how they word it, and I'm not ready yet. And so it looks like they'll be able to wait until I'm ready. And sometimes that works out because it does happen where eventually when they're ready, they get to commit. But with a fearful avoidant, that doesn't fly as easily. Fearful avoidance, when they say they're going to leave, they are going to leave. They're an avoidant. They're not going to come back. And so dismissive avoidants know that. They communicate like that. And fearful avoidants, they're willing to fight for the relationship because, in a sense, how do I explain this? Because they're not afraid. They're not afraid of rejection nearly as much as an anxious individual. Anxious individuals, they're really afraid to not be loved. So anxious individuals, they're too embarrassed to admit how much they want to fight for this relationship, which is why often they say they put a lot of ultimatums because they're trying to say, look at me, not in a bad way. It's a wound. Look at me and realize I am a person that's going to leave. They want to come across that way, but that's not actually who they are. And so you see that anxious individuals, they get very angry, but they still stay with their partner. You see that dynamic a lot. Anxious individuals, they're really upset at their partner. They're really frustrated, but they're still there. Why are you still with your partner if you're angry at them? That's how an avoidant perceives it. Like with an anxious individual, they're saying, well, it's because I love my partner, but I want them to change. But an avoidant individual feels that as a little bit really a challenge. But a fearful avoidant, they'll stay if they stay and they'll leave if they leave. So a fearful avoidance, I'm trying to explain this. A dismissive avoidant, if they do not answer their text message, a fearful avoidant is not going to, typically they're not going to play games. They're either going to call them out and they're going to say this is the way it is, or a fearful avoidant is going to say, okay, you know what? I'm going to shut down. This person's not meeting my needs. Whatever, I'm just going to leave it. And they're not going to pick on it because they've already given up. And so what ends up happening is the avoidant individual notices that challenges them to change, the dismissive avoidant. Similarly, a dismissive avoidant, they'll put a boundary down. If a fearful avoidant ends up crashing out, the dismissive avoidant will say, I'm not going to let this happen. If you do this, this relationship's not going to work. And the fearful avoidant, that hits their abandonment fear. But fearful avoidance, when their abandonment is, bumped into, I guess is the best way to put it, they don't tend to crash out. They do, but typically what happens is they stop. At one point they stop and say, okay, this is where I'm going to do something to make it better. They take accountability a little bit easier, and so they challenge each other in that way. And I actually love seeing that dynamic. It's really interesting as a therapist. That's probably one of the things I love seeing the most. The fearful avoidant, dismissive avoidant, how they challenge each other. It's just fascinating because it's very interesting. It's like they're speaking a second language, but they're not. But it's like they're speaking an emotional language that they only understand. It's actually really interesting. But I hope this video was helpful. Sorry if it was a little all over the place. Typically on today I'm recording, I have pretty early sessions. I have like 7 a.m. So I woke up really early. And then what happened, it's a long story. Basically, I was a little all over the place because it's really early right now. And I'm a little tired. But I hope this video makes sense. Please subscribe, like, and I'll see you in the next one.